So mostly today we're going to talk about symmetry, end behavior, and asymptotes. But before we do that, I would like to touch on range. Okay, and so yesterday we said that domain was inputs or x values. Range would be outputs or f of x values or y values. I hope you learned that when I taught f of x notation in algebra, I would say I'd call it fancy notation. Fancy for f of x is the same thing as what y is. Okay. All right. Now, when you're talking about, so that's what we're describing. What kind of values is the function going to output? When I'm doing interval notation, just to make a note about that, we go bottom, parentheses, top. Whereas with range, we did left to right, didn't we? And we still use a parentheses or a bracket. Okay. I'm going to put a couple things up here graphically, because again, I like graphically to describe things. Okay, for this graph, what do you guys think the range would be? Going from bottom to top, 1 to infinity. Does the graph touch 1?
Yeah.
So I use a bracket. If this were an asymptote, we would use a parenthesis. This is range now. By the way, let's back up. Oh, Jolly Rancher! I knew there was some grumbling over there. Yep. Thank you. 0, 1, silly me. Alright. Now, I'm going to give you the equation for this and talk about, let's say you didn't have a graph, how could I sort through it with an equation? The equation for this, or a possible equation, is x squared plus 1. Okay? Remember, we're talking about, hey, what kinds of values would this output? The x squared, think about this, isn't the smallest thing that x squared can be is 0? Because if you put negatives in and you square them, what happens to them? They become positive. So the smallest thing that this would output would be a 0 then, agreed? And then I add 1 to it. So I'm hoping you understand then the smallest value that this function would output would be 1, and then it would go up from there. Okay? All right. I'm going to do another one that you might see. Here's a square root curve. The square root curve has a end point of coordinates -3, 2. Do you want me to close the door? She's still living vicariously through pre-calculus open windows that she's in the band. Okay, range. What do you think now? Yeah, so bottom to top, this graph starts, remember these are y values, starts at 2 and it goes up. So for range, I would write 2 to infinity. Now, I'm going to put a function up. Again, I come at it from the perspective of I'm a really visual learner, so I like to see the graph. But I'm going to talk through them algebraically. Let's look at what a function could be. A possible function for this would be the square root of x plus 3, like that, plus 2. Okay, So we're talking about outputs now. It doesn't matter what's underneath the square root. What's the absolute smallest thing a square root could be? 0. It's not going to be negative, correct, for output? So then does it make sense that if the smallest thing that this is going to output is 0 and you're adding 2, then g of x is going to have a smallest output of 2. And it's going to go up from there. All right. Let's put one with a horizontal asymptote then. Okay. So, again, I'll put a function up for this too. Now we're going bottom to top again. What do you think about this one for range? This pesky thing here, though. Yeah. Negative infinity. What? This is like a horizontal asymptote, right? Looks like it's at 0. I'll give you a more. It's not because that this makes it 0. That's a vertical asymptote. But I'll give you a little bit more specific way how we find horizontal asymptotes, hopefully today. How about this? Okay, bottom to top, negative infinity to 0, doesn't touch 0, and then 0 to infinity. Here's the only way algebraically, you kind of have to memorize types of graphs, but this is called a hyperbola. Do you remember the name of those from last year? And hyperbolas have always horizontal and vertical asymptotes. And because you can't put 2 in, or you can't put 0 in the bottom, correct? So we have, if I put positive numbers in here, wouldn't the output be positive? And then if I put negatives, it would be negative, and so that's why we have negative infinity to 0, 0 to infinity. This never has an output of 0, because the top would have to be 0 in order for that to happen. Couldn't the top be 0? No, it's fixed at what number? 2. Yeah. Okay, so there's a little bit about talking through range. All right, so would you take out your book a second?